I'm John J. Thompson, and Bruce and I were devastated to hear of the death of Michael Bloodgood. Michael suffered a stroke months ago and was in rehab. I had just seen a post from a visit Randy Stonehill had with him a couple of weeks ago, and I thought things were looking good for Michael's recovery. But the stroke he suffered was terrible, and after months of valiant work, he succumbed. We send our deepest condolences and love to his wife Marilyn, their children and extended families, and the band and their families. This is an aching loss for our community, but so much more so for them. Our hearts are with you all. Michael was such a joy to know. In addition to being a great musician and an enthusiastic rocker, you could tell he had a pastor's heart. I'll never forget the time he spent with me when I was first dreaming up the original vision for True Tunes in the 80s. I was just a kid. I remember sitting at a hotel during one of the early Cornerstone festivals unpacking it all for him, and he was so excited for us. He had nothing but encouraging words and advice for me. Although we never had a chance to visit with Michael for this podcast, Bruce and I produced a separate Electric Jesus podcast a couple of years back to help tell the story behind the music in that film with its writer and director Chris White. Over the span of 10 episodes, we ended up unpacking not only that story, but the wider world of Christian rock and its subculture in the 80s. One of those episodes featured a conversation with Michael as an excellent representative of that era, the real-world version of one of the bands that the fictional band 316 and Electric Jesus would have been inspired by. Chris and Emily White have graciously allowed us to repurpose this interview taken from the Electric Jesus podcast and featuring Chris as the main interviewer for this special tribute to Michael Bloodgood. All right, roll it, Bruce. Episode 5, Rocking the Flock, with special guest Michael Bloodgood.
John, they always tell you when you're writing fiction to write about what you know, to start from a place, a world that you know. And when I was writing Electric Jesus, I tried to follow that advice, and I did know about evangelical Christian youth culture, but I had no idea, I had no understanding of what it would be like to be in a band, let alone a Christian metal band. Do you have any experience in being in a band? I think you are in a band, right?
Yeah.
You've played.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't never a metal band. We were more of an alternative garage rock kind of band. But back then, man, you were just, if you're playing rock and you had long hair and you were either doing rock music or you weren't. And I was a fan of extremes. I was a fan of extreme music. And yes, our guest today was definitely somebody when their first record came out. It got my attention, the album cover, the name, it was definitely something that stopped you in your tracks. And the sound was not what you were used to hearing, certainly in the Christian world. But when I saw them play, which I believe the first time I saw them play was at Cornerstone, it had this theatric, their stage set even looked like a castle, and it was very dramatic. And I'm really excited about this.
And Bloodgood, just for people who are going to listen to the podcast now and then track down all the Bloodgood music and listen to the band, they were heavy. So they were not in the more poppy glam metal kind of idea. They were for real. You know, they were more in the Judas Priest,
Iron Maiden kind of world. Right.
Yeah.
And so, and the lead singer had Broadway experience, and his presence was definitely fit that bravado and dramatic flair. And so the band was heavy, and Les Carlson, the lead singer, had that gravitas, and the package, even if you weren't a metalhead, was very, very impressive. So, and Michael Bloodgood, who we're going to get to talk to today, when I was even very young and just getting started with True Tunes and really didn't deserve a whole lot of special attention, was always somebody that took time to talk to me and encourage me, and we became friends when I was very young. And there was something very special about the heart that these guys had. They were also probably right in there with Resband when it came to their maturity. They had there were some metal bands out there that were kids, and these guys were adults. They knew what they were doing. Their heads were screwed on straight.
The band 316 in the movie Electric Jesus is really, it's not based on any specific band, but I think at least some of the music and a lot of the ethos of that band is definitely inspired by this amazing Christian metal band called Bloodgood.
Let's head into the interview suite with Michael Bloodgood of the band Bloodgood and hear what it was like for real to be in a metal band talking about God in the 80s.
You're the bass player, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you're the only band that's ever been named after the bass player, maybe?
Yeah, that could be right.
That would be a good trivia question.
Yeah, no kidding.
I'd say we go with that. That's where we lead this thing off. I'd like to start our conversation back in, I think the band officially formed in '84. You guys were out of Seattle a few years before grunge, but there was still an actual music scene and a metal scene there. I'm assuming you were just playing rock and roll. Were you a Christian at the time, or when did your musical pursuit turn into something about Jesus?
Very early on, actually. I got saved when I was a senior in high school. I kind of dropped out of my cover bands back then and didn't really want to do anything for a while. And then when I got into college, my first year of college, I formed a 3-piece band called Crossroads, original. And we started just going out playing. And we were playing, there wasn't really any Jesus music at that point. I don't think Love Song had even come out yet. So we're just we're taking hymns and trying to work them out. We're doing some cover tunes like Jesus Is Just All Right, just coming up with something to play at these coffee shops and churches where we found ourselves playing. So I've been basically playing Christian rock since, 1972.
Well, help me understand what it would have been like in that moment. I mean, coming out of sort of that Jesus people, essentially what we'd call a revival, I guess, that's happening, coming out of the 60s, and a lot of these people just kind of finding Christianity in an authentic way, and then how that merged into, well, let's just start singing songs about God. Like, how did that happen?
I was a young believer, and I found myself going, well, how am I going to relate what's happened in my life to my friends without being, just standing on a street corner with a Bible or something like that? So that's what, my friends and I decided to put this band together. Well, let's let the music do it. So that's when we started that whole deal. So it was just a way to us to communicate our life change to the people around us. So we started playing, we played at the NTC, the Naval Training Center down in San Diego, Sunday after Sunday. We did coffee shops. There's a lot of coffee shops happening back this is kind of the tail end of the Jesus movement, and parks. And, we go to church, although some churches didn't care for us very much, but we went to churches, so we just kind of, wherever we got an opportunity, we just grabbed a hold of it. And that was our way to, we're to use a term like evangelize, because we didn't know what the term evangelize meant. We just wanted to share with our friends this life change that happened to us. So that's how it kind of came about.
In those days, and then as Bloodgood, as you started playing metal and more, aggressive, going into more theatrics too in the stage show and everything, who were you more interested in playing for? A church show, or like where you knew a bunch of Christians were going to be, or where like a club or something where you knew nobody's going to be a Christian? I mean, like in your gut, what did you get more nervous about before you went out to play?
We were definitely, with Bloodgood, we were trying to reach the lost. So we didn't really care. Our whole career, we've very rarely played at church. I can count on one hand the amount of churches we played. So it's always clubs, arenas, festivals, whatever. So our target audience, especially at the very beginning, was just non-believers. Because, the Stryper had just come out and they were garnering a lot of publicity, this whole thing, how can you be a Christian and play metal, or who's going to be interested in this? So we kind of were in that same kind of a mindset. So that's where we wanted to go. We wanted to reach the lost. It wasn't until years later that we began to realize, well, we've got a lot of Christians in our audience, and so we started doing some music more about the Christian worldview, that sort of thing. But our thrust has always been evangelism.
When did you make the jump though from the Jesus music stuff you were doing to metal? Like, it seems like a pretty big shift from one to the other. What was the thinking there? What was the progress there?
Well, honestly, it was very done in innocence, because I was already involved in a band. It was my college band called Cypress. We've been together for 7 or 8 years at that point. And then, Rick Stone, who's a good friend of mine, was in a band called Serviceman. The two of us just said, let's start praying that God would raise up a band for these metal kids. Because I was working at Bandstand East, which is a rock and roll store, and all our clientele were metal. We had just a bunch of, hard rock, heavy metal bands coming in. I thought, man, who's going to reach these people, Rick and I started playing, God, lift up somebody, because I wasn't interested in doing it. I was already fine. I was busy. I was married. No big deal. But as I began to pray, specifically more by myself, it got more of a passion in my own life. Like, I all of a sudden, I think that God's calling me to do this. And I go, well, I'm not a metalhead. I'm a Beatle guy. I'm a pop music guy, whatever. And so the more I prayed, the more personal it got. And so I just started researching metal. I went to a local music warehouse, which is a chain that's long since gone, and asked the manager if she could recommend some. So she gave me Priest and Dio and Iron Maiden and all the guys were going on at that point. And I just kind of came home and with these cassette tapes and started listening to stuff, going, God, this is phenomenal music. It's so powerful. So I just started praying that God would start lifting guys up. And then JT, our first drummer, he came on. He just got off the road. And so the two of us started praying on Thursday nights. And there's seriously about a year and a half. We're just praying about what we could do. Dave Zafiro finally joined us on. So then we started rehearsing. And we're just rehearsing Van Halen tunes or whatever. We didn't have any original music at that point. And then when Les finally joined us in '84, he said, no, we're not going to do any cover tunes. Let's do original stuff. So the four of us got together. We started writing our first record, basically, in David's living room, wherever we happened to be. And that's kind of how it all came about. None of us were really metalheads per se. Les's son was really into metal. David was a shredder, but he was playing in a pop band at that time. So we just kind of conglomerated and kind of created Bloodgood to reach these kids. And, I think we did okay.
It totally makes sense that you guys found melodies and songs, and you mix the melody with like that power of heavy metal. That's really the recipe.
Yeah.
I mean, any of the great metal still is at the end of the day, it's a pop song, that's dressed up like that. And talk a little bit about Les, because Les is quite a character. You found a frontman worthy of of a metal band. How did that come about?
Well, I had met Les years before that at Bandstand East, and he was coming in to get some gear from Bob Connolly, who was a manager. And we didn't really, we went out to lunch together, and I really liked this guy. I thought he was really great, but he wasn't a believer. And years later, I took out an ad in a local magazine called Rocket Magazine, looking for a singer well grounded in the Word. And so I wish I had a camera going, because it would have been a sitcom to see the guys that used to come into my store thinking, the guy's got a cardigan sweater on. Yeah, I can sing that. Oh, really? I put on Dio, like we rock, and I'd just crank it up, and they just kind of go, and they'd walk out. But it was kind of funny. But Les is the only guy out of all these people that came in answering the ad saying, yeah, I can do that. Okay. So I gave my phone number. He wasn't too impressed with me or what was going on at that point. So he went off, tried to start his own band, but every time he started, it kept falling apart, and he kept hearing my name, Bloodgood. Finally, about 6 months later, he calls me up and goes, man, what's the deal? What's the deal with this Bloodgood? Les, you're the singer, man. I mean, I knew it the day you walked into the store that you're the guy. So we all met up together in a dive restaurant in Seattle, all the four of us, and we agreed to start the band. Don't be talking about nobody else.
You gotta knock trouble by yourself. I was curious, because you guys actually intentionally set the band up as a ministry thing. It wasn't like you were a metal band, like Sacred Warrior. There was a metal band who then became Christians and kept playing as Christians. You guys set it up to be ministry, but you were way out on the fringe of what was going on in the culture. What kind of reception did you get from the Christian community doing that kind of music, wearing those kind of clothes? doing those kind of shows. What was the reception like from the Christian community for what you were doing?
Well, when you say Christian community, I always do the quotation marks, I call it the Aryan Christians, because, our very first show, we were in Lubbock, Texas, I think, or Lufkin, Texas, one of those towns in Texas, and we had all sorts of picketers and protesters. Somebody had a 4.5 foot, 5 foot sign of me saying I was a homosexual at a prayer life, because that's what Jimmy Swaggart had announced to the world right as we were in the middle, starting our tour. So it was very antagonistic. And I call them the Aryan Christians, because when we would try to dialogue with these people, there was no dialoguing with them. We were Satan, and that's the way it was. Nobody was open to talking to us. We invited them to the concert, they wouldn't come. We showed them the lyrics on albums, they didn't want to read them. So they already kind of made their minds were made up. So we had that following us wherever we went for at least the first 2 years. It got a little bit more sporadic. We had a lot of death threats out there, but we just kind of persevered. I mean, I don't know, we didn't know any better. When I look at the documentary, I kind of look back and think, gosh, no wonder my parents were worried or whatever, So the reception was not great. Now, we had a few churches, of course, I'm a Calvary Chapel guy. None of the people at Calvary Chapel had any trouble with us. We played CC Downey and a couple of Calvary Chapels along the way. But most of those guys, they didn't really have to do us. They didn't really have to do with us either. Sacramento Warehouse, they were really cool with us. So there's a few churches out there that were very, very cool with us and had their own music ministry.
Can you talk a little bit about people who wouldn't know anything about Christian music, probably don't know the significance of Calvary Chapel and how the church, in various ways nurtured a scene. They nurtured artists and an audience, I guess you could say, and maybe even the Sacramento scene too. But can you talk a little bit about West Coast, like how the West Coast, there were communities that were promoting and nurturing artists like yourself?
Oh, sure. I mean, Chuck Smith, who was the founder of Calvary Chapel, his whole thing was kind of birthed in music. And he started his own label. So you had bands like Love Song, Mustard Seed Faith, all these artists that were just doing music, just kind of a natural thing. Like I said before, when we were kind of in the Jesus movement, it was just a natural thing. Nobody thought about, should we do this or what kind of, we just did it. Up here, there's a Calvary Chapel, Wayne Taylor's church, very receptive. We did our rock theater show there. He was very open to it. Down in Sacramento, of course, we had the Warehouse, and that, of course, that's where Exit Records came out of, 77s, Charlie Peacock. And if we didn't play at a church, sometimes the church would sponsor it and whatnot. But after you left the West Coast, it was like one day we would get to Chicago and we'd have 1,200 people at the Odeum. We'd sell it out. The next night we're in St. Louis in front of 50 people in a club. Yeah. So it's just kind of, you just kind of got used to the topsy-turvy up and down thing, doing what we did.
I actually produced the radio ad for that show at the Odeum. I was 16. I had an internship at the radio station, and they let me produce. It was you guys, Messiah Prophet, and one other band, but I got to go in with the tape machine and make it say like Saturday, whatever the date is, Bloodgood. Make a big explosion sound, and I spent probably 9 hours producing that ad. It was crazy. Just they probably played it 5 times, but that was me.
Thanks for that, John.
Can you tell me some Christian bands, a couple Christian bands that you personally like? You were a fan, like you liked those bands, and then maybe a couple of so-called secular bands that you were a fan, like true fanboy, like I'm buying the record the first day it comes out kind of thing.
Well, as far as Christian, the funny thing is we were such at the beginning of this whole thing that we were on the road, so we didn't get a lot of chance to actually hear a lot of these guys. We got to play with them like Barren Cross, Sacred Warrior, and I became big fans of these guys. Bride we saw along the way, so that's how I kind of got to see him, because we weren't really, it's kind of funny, my son always asked me about the 80s. I go, dude, I don't remember much of the 80s because I was sitting in a bus half the time, or RV or whatever. So as far as the secular bands, I'm a huge fan of Ronnie James Dio. So anything that came out of his, I was on it. I loved Judas Priest. I was kind of a late bloomer with Iron Maiden. Yeah, I've actually seen them since those days, so. But again, we were so involved doing what we were doing. other than like Alice Cooper, some of the people have been around for a while, that we didn't really get much of a chance to grasp onto some of these people. Like, we got to see Def Leppard because we were talking with their management company. So that's how we got the kind of exposure, was going down and just seeing these guys. But a lot of times we didn't really have a whole lot of, most of my taste, of course, it's stuck with Daniel Amos, the more, eclectic guys, from Chuck Smith's church and all that. Because, when we started out, there wasn't a lot of peer pressure. It was us, Barren Cross and Stryper, and maybe Messiah Prophet Band on the East Coast. So that was about, everything else. Unless somebody gave me a tape along the way, I was pretty much on our own, I guess. I don't know.
How do you feel the film captured the scene, or if you could imagine a bunch of kids getting together and starting a band in 1986 when there was, one of them's wearing a Bloodgood t-shirt at one point, and they're obviously inspired by Stryper. How do you feel that we did with that?
I think you guys really did a great job capturing it. I was just the whole time watching that film and going, dude, this is so much fun. The only thing that was hard for me to believe it was in the South, because we could never get a gig in the South. It's just like, that was like the Bible Belt was, we stopped in Florida and then went all the way back to Texas. Everything else, Georgia, Alabama, we couldn't get a gig there. But I thought the manager and the whole, anyway, I thought it was so much fun. But I think it captured the flavor and the essence of everything and all the band politics. And, it was a crazy time.
What would be, and again, you weren't in a secular band touring on the road at the time, but we all have our, the myths and the ideas. I mean, that movie, The Dirt, about Motley Crue goes to, some real extremes of what life with the band would be like, the basic low-grade hedonism that goes on. How was it different being in a Christian band, or was it?
We were pretty squeaky clean. We took our wives and our kids with us. So it was, we kind of bucked the system that way. Rock and roll was always so macho and chauvinistic, even in the Christian world. We said, no, I got married to be married, and we're going to raise our kids. So we brought my little son at the time, Paul, now he's 41. But, we raised him on the road doing homeschool, and David brought his 2 kids along as well. So we just brought our kids with us. We our wives worked Marilyn, my wife, did all the concessions. Joyce was our LD and tour manager. So we put everybody to work. And so we just kept ourselves away from those temptations, which, would have come our way. But we just, wasn't for us. So we just stuck with it. It was a family affair with Bloodgood.
And nobody's above that. I'm not trying to cast stones at anybody. Everybody's vulnerable to the excesses of the road. I mean, when you put 4 teenagers in a bus and send them out by themselves, I mean, people are going to get in trouble. It's kind of crazy when you really think about that scene and what would happen in those days.
Well, and it's also like the fact is, most traveling salespeople, you could be selling dictionaries on the road or insurance. If you're on the road and you're away from your normal community of people that hold you accountable, and people that you just don't want to think you're an idiot, whether it's what we call sort of Christian accountability or just people that you care what they think of you, you get away from those people and you're anonymous and you're in some town and you don't think anybody knows what you are. That's where trouble happens for everybody, and bands are no different. It's not like they're special. It's that happens with everybody. That's what conventions are for. That's why they have conventions in Las Vegas, for crying out loud.
Well, like I say, we always wanted to stay away from that. Always wanted to stay away from that. It was just it was too crazy, and so we let us not into temptation.
There she blows.
It's interesting how Christian metal was so separated from mainstream music. Metal was so identified with excess, and the Christian community that would tolerate metal would not tolerate mainstream music at all. It was like the Christians wanted their music to be Christian. Now what's interesting is how you go forward about 10, 20 years, and metal is one of the first genres where Christian artists started to really cross over into the mainstream in a big way. And so a lot of bands from especially the Tooth and Nail world started to get added to big metal tours and festivals, because it seemed to that the music lends itself to songs about struggle and about searching and about confrontation and about strength. What do you suppose was the basis of that need for metal music to be totally separated, Christian metal to be always Christian, and with the exception of Stryper staying in a separate world back then?
Stryper was always the exception to the rule because they were a mainstream act on a mainstream label. I know Barren Cross tried to get into that, but they didn't really quite, was a little bit late, or I don't know, maybe, the record label wasn't that interested. We were very fortunate in ours. We had a really good, aggressive retail outlet. We were in all the big stores, so we didn't face that quite a bit. But on the other hand, you had the CBA, the Christian Bookstore Association, that was taking these bands and just kind of keep them isolated. So you could never, if you wanted to get a Christian metal band, you had to go to a Christian bookstore, which a lot of people were not comfortable doing that. And so, thankful we were able to reach outside that a little bit. But as far as the Christians being accepted, that's why we like Europe so much, because Europe never gave us that kind of isolation that we had. I mean, our albums were being reviewed right next to Bon Jovi and Black Sabbath. I mean, we were in the B category. They didn't put us in the back of the magazine, or there'd be a thing on bass players, and I'd be right up there with rock. It's just crazy. So we've always loved going to Europe more because we didn't have that. We were called white metal because our message was positive. I said, well, it's only positive if you believe it. I think the isolation was a lot of the CBA's responsibility. And I think a lot of these kids or fans who were into it, they kind of wanted to keep you for themselves. Right.
But it was interesting that you guys were able to draw big mainstream crowds in Europe and in Brazil as another place where metal stayed really popular for a long time. And part of that was because those markets didn't force the segregation, and that segregation was coming from both the church side and, in America, the secular side and the church side, you're saying.
Yeah, and with Brazil or Latin America, people have just discovered us on the internet. There's no album pushing, there's no record labels. All of our videos have been translated to Spanish or Portuguese. And we haven't done any of that. That's just all happened very organically through the internet. So we love it. We're supposed to play, the Éxodo Festival in Mexico twice. Now they've both been canceled. But so we have this big following in Mexico. Les and I did a podcast. I don't know, maybe it was Les or maybe it was just me. I don't remember. There was like 16,000 people on this podcast. It was crazy. And we've never had a record company or distribution or anything down there. The internet's been a blessing for us, at least. For pretty much all the other acts, because these kids discover you for the first time. They like the lyrics, like the spirit behind it, and boom,
On behalf of those imprisoned by the state, or locked up by the shame of their own fate, let me tell you, you can be Barabbas, you can be Barabbas, you can be Barabbas too. You can be Barabbas, you can be Barabbas, you can be Barabbas too. You can be Barabbas, you can be Barabbas, you can be Barabbas too. You can be Barabbas, you can be Barabbas, you can be Barabbas too.
Michael, if you could go back in time to the summer of 1986 and knowing what you know now, and you are a pastor at this point, what would you say to those guys in 316 if you were there? Maybe they're about to leave with their manager on the road. What does Michael Bloodgood say to them as they go out on this journey? What advice would you give them?
Don't quit your day job. Just kidding. You've got to stay in the Word of God. The Word of God has to be fundamental. It can't be ambiguous. It's got to be the authoritative, controlling force in your world, and you need to stay there. We always had Bible studies as a band. We always went to church on Sundays, even if we hadn't gotten any sleep on Saturday nights. We kept the main thing, keeping Jesus at the center, keeping the message about him at the center, because you're going to get attacks from all sides of the the coin, wherever where you go. And you have to just know that God's called you to do this, and this is what you're going to do. And, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. That's the kind of mentality you have to have, because, often we've been on the road, our transmission is just broken down, our head gasket got blown, we have no money, we're in the middle of no place, and we just go, what are we doing here? But we knew that God had called us to be there. And we have that assurance. Again, if your calling is true and your ministry is true, then God's going to get you to the other side. You have to just keep it going. Stay in the Word of God, stay in prayer, keep the simple things simple, and God will show you, how to get to the other side.
I will climb to the top of a mountain on my knees just to be with you. I will ride on the wings of the wind, 'cause I believe in you.
Let me just reiterate, if you have not seen the documentary Trenches of Rock, about the band Bloodgood, about the experiences, some of which that Michael was just talking to us about, you really should see it. If something in this podcast has made you interested in the whole Christian metal or rock scene, that one, and if I'd seen that documentary before Electric Jesus, I may have just said, I don't need to make Electric Jesus. There's that documentary. It's really good. It's really good.
But now, having heard from Michael Bloodgood and previously Glenn Kaiser, is there anything that you heard from them that surprises you? Anything that you didn't expect when you were making up a Christian metal band out of thin air?
Well, part of it is they have the benefit of telling their story many years later with a lot of wisdom and perspective that if we had interviewed them contemporary, in the time, they probably would have. So I'm a huge fan of the wisdom and maturity that we gain, hopefully, as we age. There's just a sweetness to those guys, a sincerity, a gentleness to their, or a simplicity even to their acceptance of their faith, their understanding of it, and their sense of sharing it in the form of music that is just, I don't know, it's just sweet. It's even if you're cynical about that sort of thing, or even if you're a little skeptical about those tactics, which I definitely am. I don't know that the best way to talk about God and eternity with people is through hard rock. Maybe for some people it is. I don't know if it'd be my way of doing that, but or the way to reach me, maybe. But there is a sweetness and a sincerity to it that is just is surprising. Not that I thought they were charlatans or fake about it. It's nice hearing them talk about it in a way that isn't cynical at all. Cynicism of any kind is just a huge turnoff to me, and I love their the sweetness that they talk about it with.
So anything about their stories that was different than how you had imagined what life would have been like, or anything that I thought I think Daniel Smith kind of brought this up in the Glenn episode. I just thought they lived more like rock stars. I mean, I just thought the buses were, tripped out and sweet, and that, they stayed at the 5-star hotel and, ate prime rib every night that they wanted to. And, I just had as a teenager, I thought this, and even, I guess, as an adult, now that I realize it, thinking back on it, that rock star myth was, I just kind of thought that's what it was like back then. But I mean, both these guys are pretty clear on the fact that nope, wasn't like that. And some of that may be because they would they came out on stage with the cool clothes and the cool hair and these instruments that look cool and these
light shows or
right.
the presentation,
Yeah.
it all looks cool. But, when you're actually thinking about that, it's like, well, there was probably one set of those cool clothes.
And they smelled really, really bad after
yeah.
2 days.
And their hair, as long as it's long and you got some hairspray, you can look like a rock star. So, I think the surprising thing to me and the details of it was kind of like our movie where you're driving around in a hand-me-down RV if you're lucky,
right?
And you're playing gigs in a lot of sketchy places, and no one's really making that much money,
right, if any.
So,
right.
Yeah.
I remember. I will say, like the most surprising thing. Well, one of the most surprising things for me was, finding out that when I was a kid, finding out that my favorite rock stars couldn't afford to make a living even doing their music. That people
Right.
like Michael Rowe were paying the bills by being guitar teachers. That some of my favorite rock stars were janitors when they were off the road. They were carpenters or whatever. That was the first shocker. But then when I went and visited the Jesus People USA community where Glenn and Wendy and the Res Band people lived, and where they ministered to homeless people, where they handed out clothes and meals, and I actually walked around that place the first time, probably in about 1987, maybe 86, and I saw them in the halls with everybody else, and everybody there looked like Res Band. Everybody there had kind of aging hippie hair and kind of, ragged looking clothes. I was like, oh wait, those aren't stage clothes. That's just how everybody here dresses. Yeah. I mean, they were all wearing old, like, hand-me-down Res shirts that, hadn't sold from a previous tour and that kind of stuff.
Oh,
but
right.
They were all actually doing the stuff that they told us we should be doing. They were there in the city in a bad neighborhood where bullets were flying. They were there loving unlovable people, giving their lives. And at 16, 17 years old, I was like, this is the most heavy metal punk rock thing I've ever seen. Like, I've never seen a rock band, a secular, whatever you want to call it, rock band, living the rock and roll rebellion like this. This is it. And that sold me. That was like, this is the most rock and roll thing I've ever seen. And this is the gospel and rock and roll right here. This is it, and I was gone.
Yeah,
that was it.
That's a really fascinating perspective that I don't think a lot of people have, or I don't think a lot of people would think about it that way.
I never ever saw that in a Christian bookstore.
No, and whatever your religion or politics, whatever your issue was in any band, to actually see bands living it out. Yeah. Like actually, or any kind of celebrity or an endorsement or something, to see people actually being like that when nobody's looking, that would definitely make an impression on you for sure. But yeah, Bloodgood. I mean, Michael Bloodgood's awesome, and if you're curious about that band, just the theatrics of that band, the show that the way they brought. If you're a fan of that kind of music, then the music's really strong. But also they were delivering. They knew that delivering a great show was part of, their ethos and what they were trying to do, and it does. I mean, you can see Trenches of Rock again. Well, let's make sure we have that in the show notes. You gotta catch a glimpse at that because it's really good.
Thanks, Chris and Emily White, for letting us reuse this interview. And if you have not heard the Electric Jesus podcast, you really should check it out. Over those 10 episodes, you'll hear conversations with Glenn Kaiser, Doug Van Pelt, Leah Payne, Michael Rowe, Daniel Smith, Christy York Wooten, Steve Taylor, and the Coup de Grace, a joint conversation between Stryper's Michael Sweet and Amy Grant herself. It really was something special. You can find the Electric Jesus podcast on most platforms. You can also find an episode of the True Tunes podcast in our archives that took you to the set of the Electric Jesus film with most of the cast, including a conversation with lead actor Brian Baumgartner, and a separate episode that featured a conversation between Chris White and Andy Irwin, the writer and director of the Jesus music film, so don't miss those. And of course, you can find Electric Jesus on demand now on all of the digital platforms like Apple, Amazon, and so on. And when you watch it, watch for the Bloodgood t-shirts and imagine how things might have gone differently for 316 if they had been able to go out on tour with a guy like Michael Bloodgood. What a loss. I know, to be gone from the body is to be present with the Lord. I believe that. Something better awaits us. But I'm not going to lie. Losses like this just suck. They hurt. After the death of his wife Joy, C.S. Lewis nailed it when he said, "The pain I feel now is part of the happiness I had before. That's the deal." The richness we experience in a life filled with friends and family, the joy of moments, means the sting of loss. And yes, the lingering spiritual question of the nature of love and the essence of the gospel that Michael spent his life spreading is that love draws us home. But the death still stings in the here and now. It may not have ultimate victory, but it does still sting, and I'm not going to deny that. Okay, I didn't mean to get up on my soapbox, but I'm stepping off. Thanks, Bruce, for conceiving of this special tribute and for offering to pull it all together. And thank you, Michael Bloodgood, for a life well lived and a long obedience in a very loud direction. Rest in peace, my brother.
The proceeding was produced by John J. Thompson and Bruce A. Brown for Gyroscope Productions and is intended for the private use of our listening audience. The contents are protected by US copyright law and are the intellectual property of Gyroscope Productions, with the exception of songs or clips that are from previously copywritten materials. Everything on this episode is used by permission or under fair use provisions.